You are standing in a village square in northern China. The sun is burning the back of your neck. Dust coats your throat. A man you have never seen before walks toward you, tilts your chin toward the light, and runs his thumb along your jawline. He opens your mouth and counts your teeth, the way a farmer inspects a horse before buying it. Your hands are pulled forward. He examines your fingers, squeezes the tips, bends each one, turns your palms over and traces the lines like he's reading a map of your future. A future he is about to purchase. He turns to your father, says a number. Your mother collapses behind you. Your father doesn't look at you. He just holds out his hand, and coins drop into his palm. Just like that, you don't belong to your family anymore. You don't understand what's happening. You don't know where you're going. All you know is that your mother is screaming your name. And your father is standing perfectly still, staring at the ground, refusing to meet your eyes. The man takes your hand, pulls you forward. You look back one last time. Your mother reaches for you. Someone holds her back. You will never see this village again. You will never hear your real name spoken out loud again. Because in the imperial courts of China, there existed a system that lasted for over 2,000 years. A system so embedded in the culture that historians recorded it the same way they recorded tax policy: routine, normal, ordinary. They were called nanong, male favourites, young men purchased, trained and kept as personal companions for emperors, nobles and wealthy officials. What happened to them inside the walls of China's palaces was so carefully hidden that the world essentially forgot it existed until now. The system was built on hunger. The Han Dynasty ruled China for over 400 years. During that time, famine struck entire provinces every few years. The Yellow River flooded, monsoons failed, crops rotted in the fields, and when a family ran out of grain, out of livestock, out of everything they owned, they were forced to make decisions no parent should ever have to make. Professional scouts travelled through the poorest regions of the empire. They had a specific name, Rana. It translates literally to human teeth. That was the title given to men whose profession was finding young people worth buying. They searched for very particular qualities: clear skin, bright eyes, delicate bone structure, a voice that could carry a melody. But it wasn't only about appearance. They needed intelligence, the ability to learn quickly, memorize poetry, hold a conversation with a man who governed a province. Because the buyers weren't looking for servants, they were looking for companions. And companions needed to be impressive. The inspection process was deliberately humiliating. Young men were examined in front of their own families. Hands were checked for artistic potential. Long fingers suggested they could master the guqin, the seven-stringed instrument considered essential in any educated household. Scouts studied bone structure, claiming they could predict how a face would look in 5 years. Those who passed were taken immediately. Contracts were written in classical Chinese that most farming families couldn't read. A father would mark a document with his seal, or simply nod, signing away his son for 10 to 15 years of service. Most didn't understand the terms. Those who did understood. There was no other option. But here is what no one talks about. Most of them never came home. Not because the contracts held them, but because by the time the terms ended, there was nothing left of the person who had signed them. The first thing they removed was your identity. You arrived carrying everything you owned: a pair of sandals, a wooden comb your mother had given you, and a name that connected you to a family, a village, a life. Within hours, all of it was gone. Each young man received a new name, something ornamental, something designed to sound expensive: precious jade, autumn moon, morning frost. These weren't terms of affection. They were product labels designed to make the merchandise more appealing to wealthy buyers. Your head was shaved. You were dressed in silk robes that marked you as property, not a person, and from that moment forward, every hour of your existence belonged to someone else. The training program was sophisticated, and that's precisely what made it so devastating. These young men were not being prepared for domestic work. They were being shaped into the most refined companions money could buy. They memorized thousands of verses of classical Chinese poetry, practiced calligraphy until their brushstrokes were flawless, learned instruments, dance and song, studied medicine, accounting, political philosophy, anything that might increase their value at auction. And all of this sounds almost civilized until you understand what was happening beneath the education. The real curriculum was psychological destruction. Any expression of homesickness was treated as a behavioral defect and corrected through punishment. Any sign of independence was eliminated. Any memory of home, of family, of who they had been before, was methodically dismantled until the young man genuinely believed that his only purpose in the world was to please his future master. That was the goal. Not obedience, belief. They didn't need people who merely complied. They needed people who had forgotten there was any other way to exist. According to accounts from the Tang Dynasty, which ruled from 618 to 907 AD, the cost of this process was staggering. Historical records suggest that roughly 4 out of every 10 young men purchased for training did not survive long enough to enter service. 4 out of 10, consumed by exhaustion, malnutrition, and the psychological weight of having their entire identity erased before they were old enough to understand what identity even meant. The ones who didn't survive were buried without markers. Their families were never contacted. They simply disappeared, as if they had never been born. And here is the part that is hardest to accept. We are not talking about a war. We are not talking about a plague. We are talking about a business model that calculated a 40% loss rate and considered it acceptable. The trainers knew, the scouts knew, the family suspected, and the system continued for centuries because the math worked for everyone except the people being sold. This was not random cruelty. This was an industry. Scouts earned commissions, trainers charged fees. Human beings were priced according to a market that valued youth, beauty, and obedience above everything else, including survival. For the survivors, success was a different kind of captivity. Their quarters reflected their impossible position, elevated above servants, invisible to wives. Decorated rooms with silk curtains, jade ornaments, lacquered furniture. Beautiful, comfortable, and locked from the outside. Silk on the walls, iron on the doors. Daily life was an unending performance. They woke before dawn to spend hours on preparation, cosmetics, robes, hair, because you never knew when you would be summoned. Appearing unprepared was the fastest way to fall from favour. And falling from favour in this world didn't mean reassignment. It meant being replaced, discarded, expelled, with nothing but the clothes on your back. No skills, no family connections, no history anyone would acknowledge. By the age of 20, your usefulness was considered in decline. By 25, you were invisible. Competition inside these households was vicious and intentional. Masters deliberately set their companions against one another, rewarding whoever entertained best, punishing whoever pleased least. Trust between them was impossible. Friendship was dangerous. The person sleeping in the room beside you would betray you without hesitation if it bought them one more week in the master's good graces. Older survivors became ruthless themselves because they had absorbed the only lesson the system ever truly taught. Weakness gets you replaced. Food itself was weaponized. Favorites received delicacies. Those who had fallen from grace survived on scraps. Your physical appearance was the only barrier between you and catastrophe, and your master controlled whether you ate well enough to maintain it. What the official histories omit entirely. Many turned to numbing agents to endure. Certain remedies circulated freely in wealthy households and offered the only available escape from the psychological torment of daily existence inside the system. The dependency that followed made them more controlled, more trapped, which of course was the point. The psychological toll was severe. Though records consistently obscured the circumstances, Ming Dynasty accounts reference multiple cases of young men who simply could not endure any longer. These deaths were reported as accidents to protect the household's reputation, because in this system, even your final act was something they could erase. Everything described so far happened in private households across China. Inside the imperial palace, this system operated at an entirely different scale. According to historian Brett Hinch, who wrote what scholars consider the definitive academic study on this subject, all 10 emperors during the first 2 centuries of the Han Dynasty had documented male favourites. All 10. This was not a scandal, it was not a secret, it was recorded in official government histories, with the same tone used to document military appointments and tax revenues. One story, however, stands above all the others. It changed the Chinese language itself. His name was Dong Xian. He entered the imperial court around 4 BC, the son of a minor official, approximately 17 years old. The Book of Han, one of China's most significant historical texts, describes him as having a face like white jade and eyes that sparkled. Emperor Ai noticed him during a routine court ceremony. From that moment, the emperor's obsession began to consume the entire machinery of government. The gifts came first: estates, titles, treasure worth what would be millions today. Dong Xian's father was elevated to marquess. His sister was brought into the imperial harem. An entire private residence, rivaling the imperial palace itself, was constructed solely for him. Then came the political appointments. Anyone who objected was destroyed. Prime Minister Wang Jia wrote a carefully worded letter warning the emperor that his devotion to Dong Xian was becoming dangerous. He cited historical precedent. He reminded the emperor of Deng Tong, Emperor Wen's favourite from a century earlier. That story is worth telling in full, because it is the perfect warning that no one ever listened to. Deng Tong began as a boatman, a nobody. Emperor Wen noticed him because of a dream. He had dreamed he was climbing toward heaven, unable to reach it, until a man in a yellow hat pushed him upward. When he woke, he searched the palace and found Deng Tong, a rower who wore a yellow cap. The resemblance to the dream was enough. From that day forward, Deng Tong became the emperor's closest companion. The rewards were extraordinary. He was given a copper mine and the exclusive right to mint his own currency, coins that circulated across the entire empire. He grew wealthier than princes. His devotion was absolute. When Emperor Wen developed a painful infected wound, Deng Tong cleaned it with his own mouth. Not even the crown prince was willing to do that. A fortune teller examined Deng Tong and announced that he would die of starvation. Emperor Wen laughed. "I made him rich," he said. "How could he possibly starve?" When Emperor Wen died, the answer became clear immediately. The new emperor, who had never forgiven the humiliation of being outshone by a commoner at his own father's deathbed, confiscated everything overnight. Every coin, every property, every title. The richest man in China died on the streets, penniless, from starvation, exactly as predicted. Prime Minister Wang Jia told Emperor Ai this story as a warning. Emperor Ai had him arrested on fabricated charges. Wang Jia did not survive the imprisonment. By 1 BC, Dong Xian had been appointed supreme commander of the armed forces. He was 22 years old, no military training, no battlefield experience. the most powerful military position in China, given to a man whose sole qualification was that the emperor could not bear to be without him. And then came the moment that would define Chinese culture for the next 2,000 years. A quiet afternoon in the imperial chambers, Emperor Ai and Dong Xian lying side by side on a mat after the midday meal. Dong Xian falls asleep. His head slowly comes to rest on the sleeve of the emperor's robe. Emperor Ai needs to rise. Court business does not pause for emperors. He looks down at Dong Xian, sleeping peacefully, his head on the imperial sleeve. He could simply wake him. Any reasonable person would. Instead, Emperor Ai reaches for a blade and carefully, silently, cuts off his own imperial sleeve rather than disturb Dong Xian's rest. That single act became the most famous love story in Chinese history. The story spread through the court overnight. Officials began cutting their own sleeves in imitation. The phrase, "the passion of the cut sleeve," became the standard Chinese expression for this kind of devotion, and it remained in common use for over 2 millennia. It is still recognized today. In August of 1 BC, Emperor Ai collapsed. He was 26 years old. Reports indicate he had been declining for months, but the court was unprepared for the speed of what followed. On his deathbed, barely able to speak, he gave a final order that stunned everyone in the chamber. He commanded that the throne pass to Dong Xian. The Grand Empress Dowager moved within hours. She seized the imperial seal, reinstated Wang Mang as regent, stripped Dong Xian of every title, every rank, every possession he had accumulated across 5 years of imperial favour. On the same day he lost everything, Dong Xian and his wife were both found dead before sunset. The most powerful man in China had woken that morning in a palace. By sunset, he was gone. Because in this system, a favourite's power lasted exactly as long as the emperor's heartbeat, not 1 second longer. And I believe that is the cruelest element of this entire story. Not the poverty that initiated it, not the training that broke them. It is the illusion. The system allowed you to believe you had escaped. It dressed you in silk, granted you titles, placed you beside the most powerful person on earth. And then, in the span of a single afternoon, it demonstrated that none of it had ever truly been yours. You were never powerful. You were never safe. You were decoration. And decorations get replaced. Dong Xian's fate was not exceptional. It was the template. Deng Tong starved to death after his emperor died. Han Yan, the favourite of Emperor Wu, was granted access to the imperial harem itself and was executed by the empress dowager for exceeding his permitted boundaries. This cycle repeated across every dynasty, every generation. The favourites rose, the emperors died, and the men who had been given everything were stripped of everything the moment the throne changed hands. The hypocrisy was staggering in its consistency. Confucian scholars wrote volumes on virtue and moral governance while purchasing young men from starving families. Buddhist monks preached detachment from worldly desire while concealing favourites in monastery quarters. Government officials passed laws regulating the practice while participating in it privately. The system did not exist alongside Chinese moral philosophy. It existed because of Chinese power structures. Favourites were political instruments, rewards, weapons, and symbols of an emperor's absolute freedom from consequence. 500 years after Dong Xian, the Ming dynasty's emperor Zhengde took this tradition to its most extreme conclusion. He abandoned the Forbidden City entirely. Consider what that means, the most secure, most powerful structure in the world. And he walked out of it because it was insufficiently entertaining. He constructed a 200-room private complex known as the Leopard Quarter, built adjacent to the Imperial Zoo. He filled it with companions, performers, monks, wrestlers, and favourites, gathered from across the empire. He surrounded himself with a circle of eunuchs known as the Eight Tigers, who controlled physical access to the emperor, and through him to the entire government. He lived there from 1508 until his death in 1521, 13 years, conducting the affairs of an empire between zoo hunts and elaborate celebrations that scandalized the entire court. Ministers who needed the emperor's signature on essential state documents had to navigate around the zoo to find him. When officials protested, he had them beaten publicly. According to the Cambridge History of China, between 12 and 14 of them did not survive the punishment. When Zhengde died at 29 after falling from a boat, his successor dismantled the leopard quarter immediately. Every favourite, every companion, every performer, recalled, punished, or exiled. 70 chests of gold and 2,200 chests of silver were confiscated from a single one of his associates. 2,000 years. The same story, rise, fall, erasure, repeat. The practice finally declined with the collapse of the Qing dynasty. The revolution of 1911 ended the imperial system, and with it the aristocratic world that had sustained this tradition for millennia. The communist victory in 1949 brought consequences of a different kind. Former concubines were interrogated during political campaigns, forced to testify against their former masters. Some were punished as symbols of the old feudal order. Others were sent to labour camps. The revolution that proclaimed liberation for the oppressed simply found new uses for the same people the old system had already destroyed. The last generation of male concubines was largely abandoned, left by masters who feared the new government, without resources, without skills suited to independent survival, without anyone willing to acknowledge knowing them. Some disappeared into China's vast population, carrying their stories with them into silence. Others did not survive the transition. We know the names of the emperors. We know the names of the favourites who reached the highest positions: Dong Xian, Deng Tong, Han Yan. We know the name of Dong Xian's wife, who chose to leave the world beside him on the day everything was taken. But the nameless ones, the ones sold from their villages and buried without markers before they ever reached adulthood, the ones who survived the training only to be discarded when their youth faded, the ones who spent their final years begging on streets they hadn't chosen, in cities they'd been brought to against their will, carrying names that had never been theirs. We don't know a single one of them. 2,000 years of this system. Millions of families who made the same impossible choice. Millions of young men who walked through those doors and never walked back out. And the system was so thorough, so precisely engineered, that it erased even the memory of the people it consumed. That is not simply cruelty. That is architecture. This is HISTOR. We don't clean up history. We show you what actually happened. Thank you for watching.